I walked into my grandmother's wake. I wore the same boots I'd bought at Value Village when I was 19, scuffed at the toe, one eyelet missing on the left. I kept them for 16 years, not because I couldn't afford better ones. I could, easily, but because they reminded me of who I was when I had nothing. And that morning, walking up the front steps of Beaumont Funeral Home in Barrie, Ontario, I needed to remember exactly who I was. My uncle was standing by the door. He saw me before I saw him, and for a split second, maybe half a breath, something crossed his face. Not guilt, not relief, just calculation. The same look he used to give me across the dinner table when I was a teenager. The look that said, "I'm already 3 steps ahead of you, so don't bother." I smiled at him anyway. I practiced being calm for a long time. I should explain something first because without it, none of the rest makes sense. My grandmother, Gran to me, Evelyn to everyone else, raised me from the time I was 8 years old. My mother had her own battles, and my father had his own life somewhere out west that didn't include me. And Gran was the one who showed up with her station wagon and her no-nonsense expression and said, "Come on then, pack a bag." So I did. And for the next 9 years, that little bungalow on Carson Street in Barrie was the only home I knew. My Uncle Neil lived 3 blocks away. He was Gran's son, her only son. And from the moment I moved in, he treated me like a liability. Not with cruelty exactly, more with this particular brand of dismissal that only certain people know how to deploy. He never forgot my birthday maliciously. He just consistently forgot it. He never excluded me from family dinners on purpose. He just consistently didn't mention when they were happening. Gran saw it. She used to squeeze my hand in the kitchen after those dinners and say, "He's scared of people he can't control. Don't take it personally." I tried. For years I tried. When I was 17, I overheard a conversation I was never meant to hear. I'd come home early from school, some kind of teacher planning day I'd forgotten about, and Neil was at the kitchen table with Gran. The door was open. I stopped in the hallway when I heard my name. "She's not yours, Mum. She's not even family. Not really. You've done your part. She's old enough to manage." I didn't hear Gran's response. I didn't need to. I took my backpack upstairs and sat on the edge of my bed for a very long time. I didn't say anything to Gran. I didn't want her to feel caught in the middle of something I wasn't sure she could win. Instead, I made myself a promise. I was going to be so fine that nobody could ever call me a burden again. I worked through high school, saved every dollar from waitressing and weekend shifts at the Canadian Tire on Dunlop Street. When I graduated, I applied for every bursary I could find and got into nursing school at Georgian College. Gran cried at the orientation. Neil didn't come. I moved to Toronto at 22, got my RN, then my nurse practitioner certification over the next 8 years. I worked in a cardiac unit at St. Michael's Hospital. I was good at it, not because I was exceptional in some obvious way, but because I was patient. I knew how to wait. I knew how to watch. I knew how to read a room and know exactly when something was about to shift. My husband, whose name I'll call Declan because he's a private person, and I love him enough to protect that, worked for the Canada Revenue Agency. He'd been a senior investigator in the aggressive tax planning division for 11 years. He was quiet and methodical, and he made the best Saturday morning pancakes I had ever eaten in my life. We met at a friend's cottage on Georgian Bay, argued about dock safety regulations, and were married 14 months later. We were happy. That matters to the story because people sometimes assume that women with difficult family histories are broken in ways that last forever. I want to be clear. I wasn't broken. I was built differently. There's a distinction. Gran's health started declining when I was 31. Kidney function, then her heart, then the particular kind of tired that comes from a body deciding it's ready to stop working so hard. I drove up to Barrie every few weeks. I sat with her on the couch, and we watched old episodes of The Fifth Estate, and I rubbed her feet because her circulation was poor, and she complained about it constantly. Neil was always there when I arrived, never when Gran called him. There, when I arrived, the second time I showed up and found him at the kitchen table with a coffee and Gran's reading glasses on, going through a stack of papers on the counter. I asked what he was looking at. "Just keeping things organized," he said. "You know how Mum is. Things pile up." Gran was asleep in the next room. I stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at my uncle and understood, with the specific clarity that comes from knowing someone for over 2 decades, exactly what was happening. I drove back to Toronto that night and told Declan what I'd seen. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I love most about him. When I finished, he said, "Do you want me to look into a few things, or do you want to handle this yourself?" I said both. We spent the next 3 months being very careful and very quiet. I called Gran's longtime lawyer, a woman in her 60s named Harriet who'd handled Gran's affairs since the 90s, and asked for a private meeting. Harriet had known me since I was 8 years old. She did not seem surprised to hear from me. Gran passed in February, quietly, in her own bed, on the Tuesday afternoon while I was holding her hand and the space heater in the corner was making that clicking sound it always made. Neil called me 4 hours later, which told me he hadn't been there. The wake was held on a Thursday. I drove up from Toronto with Declan. He was wearing his good coat, the charcoal one, and he had his work ID in his inside breast pocket the way he always did, out of habit. He squeezed my hand in the parking lot and said, "You don't have to prove anything today." I said I knew that. I think I even meant it. Neil was at the door as I said. He let me in without a word, which was generous of him, all things considered, because what he was about to do required me to be inside the building first. The funeral home was the kind of place that smelled like carpet cleaner and lilies and had soft lighting designed to make everyone look a little softer, a little less real. Gran's friends from her church group were there, her neighbor from across the street, a few cousins I recognized distantly, people whose names I was searching for in the part of my brain that stores childhood. I was talking to Gran's neighbor, a warm woman in her 70s who used to bring Gran soup when her knee was bad. When Neil appeared at my elbow, he brought someone with him, a man I didn't recognize, in his 50s, wearing a blazer over a golf shirt. Not funeral attire exactly, but confident enough that it didn't matter. "I need a word with you," Neil said, not quietly, loud enough that the 3 or 4 people closest to us could hear. "Now?" I said. "Now." I excused myself from Gran's neighbor and stepped slightly to the side. The man in the blazer stayed close. Neil glanced at him once, that same calculating look, and then turned to me. He said that Gran's estate was going through a formal review. He said there were concerns. He used that word, concerns, about the legitimacy of certain documents that had been filed in the past several months. He said my name had come up in connection with those concerns. I said, "What kind of concerns?" He said there was a question of whether Gran had been, and here he paused for effect. I give him that, unduly influenced in her final months by someone with access to her home and her affairs. He meant me. He meant that I had manipulated a dying woman into changing her will. He was saying this at her wake, in front of her church friends. I want to tell you that I felt something dramatic in that moment. Rage, maybe, or humiliation. What I actually felt was very quiet. The way I feel sometimes in the cardiac unit when a patient's numbers start going in the wrong direction and I have about 45 seconds to think clearly. Everything slows down. Everything gets very precise. I said, "That's an interesting thing to say at your mother's wake, Neil." He said that emotions weren't the issue. Legality was the issue. He said that if I had any sense, I would make this easier for everyone. And then, and this is the part I'll remember for the rest of my life, he said, "You were never really hers. Not legally. You know that." I heard someone nearby draw breath. Gran's neighbor. She'd moved closer without my noticing. I looked at my uncle and I said, "I'd like you to meet my husband." Declan had been standing 6 feet away the entire time. He stepped forward. He's not a large man, not physically imposing in any obvious way. He has reading glasses he keeps in his shirt pocket, and he drives a sensible car, and he makes pancakes on Saturdays. But he has a particular quality of stillness that, when he chooses to deploy it, is profoundly unsettling to people who are used to being the most prepared person in a room. He said, "Hello, Neil. I've been looking forward to this." The man in the blazer, Neil's lawyer, I would later find out, shifted his weight slightly. Declan reached into his breast pocket, not for a badge. He pulled out a folded letter printed on CRA letterhead, which he handed to Neil's lawyer, not Neil. That detail was deliberate. He told me later he decided the lawyer deserved to know first what his client had gotten him into. The letter was a notice of assessment initiation. What it meant, in plain language, Declan's division had opened a formal review of Neil's financial affairs, specifically the management of a family trust that Gran had established in 2009. A trust that Neil had been administering and from which, over the past 6 years, approximately $340,000 had moved in ways that weren't clearly documented. The trust had 2 named beneficiaries. Neil was one of them. I was the other. Neil had not been distributing my share. He'd been reporting it as administrative costs. His lawyer read the letter. I watched his face. I watched the exact moment he understood the scope of what he'd been hired to walk into. Neil said something. I don't remember exactly what. Something about this not being the time or the place. Something about family. The word family from him. At that moment, in that room, I said, "You told me I was never really hers." Not legally. I let that sit for a second. Legally, I was. Gran formalized my guardianship when I was 9. You were at the courthouse. You signed as a witness. The man in the blazer touched Neil's arm and said, very quietly, "We should step outside." Neil looked at me. For the first time in 30-odd years of knowing each other, he looked at me like he wasn't sure what I was going to do next. That felt better than I expected. I won't tell you that the rest of the day was easy. It wasn't. I cried in the bathroom alone for about 10 minutes because my grandmother was dead and I missed her, and the person who should have been grieving alongside me had spent the past 30 years treating me like a problem to be managed. Grief is strange that way. It doesn't care about timing. Gran's neighbor found me afterward by the refreshment table. She put her hand on my arm and said, "Evelyn always said you were the sharpest one in the room." She said it like a brag. And then she handed me a small cucumber sandwich and walked away, which felt exactly right. Declan and I drove home that evening. He drove because I was tired in a specific way that had nothing to do with sleep. I watched the highway lights come on as we got closer to the city, that familiar orange glow. "Did you know he'd had someone there?" I asked. I suspected. He kept his eyes on the road. "People, like your uncle, always have someone there." "Were you nervous?" He thought about that for a moment. "Professionally? No. Personally?" He glanced at me. "Yeah, a bit." I'd put my hand on his arm, and we drove the rest of the way without talking, which is one of the ways I know we belong together. The formal process took 8 months. I won't walk you through all of it because parts of it were genuinely tedious, and parts of it involved legal language I still don't entirely understand. What I will tell you is this. The trust was recalculated. My share, what should have been mine over 6 years, was returned with interest. The CRA assessment of Neil's personal finances revealed additional irregularities that became their own separate matter, one I'm not privy to and frankly don't need to be. Gran's will, the one Harriet had helped her draft in October, the one Neil had tried to call into question, was upheld. It was clean. Gran had known exactly what she was doing. She'd been sharp until the end, whatever anyone wanted to suggest otherwise. The house on Carson Street came to me. I've been back twice since the estate settled. Once to sort through Gran's things, which took a full weekend and left me wrecked in the best possible way. Her handwriting in the margins of cookbooks, her collection of tea towels from every province she'd ever visited, the photograph of the two of us at my nursing school graduation that she kept on her nightstand, and once, more recently, just to sit in the backyard on the old Muskoka chair and drink a coffee and look at the garden she'd kept for 40 years. There's a lilac bush along the back fence. She planted it the year I moved in. It blooms every May. I didn't realize until I was standing in that yard that I'd been timing my visits wrong all these years. I'd always come in summer or fall, never in spring. I made a note in my phone to come back in May. That felt like something Gran would have said. "You missed the lilacs. Come back in May." Practical and loving and slightly pointed, the way she always was. I've thought a lot since then about what I would say to my younger self. The 17-year-old in the hallway, holding her breath, listening to an uncle explain to a grandmother why she shouldn't bother with me. I used to think I would tell her not to be afraid, but I don't think that's quite right anymore. She wasn't afraid exactly. She was just very, very quiet. I'd tell her to stay quiet. I'd tell her that silence is not the same thing as surrender. That watching and waiting and building something real, brick by brick, year after year, is not the same thing as losing. That the people who dismiss you are counting on you to fold before they have to show their hand. Don't fold. I kept those boots, by the way. I wore them to every one of my court appointments, scuffed toe and all. Some things you keep not because you've forgotten where you came from, but because you want to remember exactly how far the road has been. I've been asked a few times since everything came out, by friends, by a couple of colleagues at the hospital, whether I felt bad for Neil, whether some part of me wished things had gone differently between us. I've thought about that honestly, and the answer is, not the way people expect. I don't feel triumphant about what happened to him. That's not really what I walked away with. What I walked away with was something quieter, and I think more useful, a very clear understanding of how choices compound over time, not in the cosmic sense, not in any way I could point to and call fate or justice handed down from somewhere, just in the ordinary, mechanical way that decisions stack up, the way a person can spend decades making small, self-serving choices and genuinely not notice that those choices are building a wall around them until the moment they need someone in their corner and there's no one there. Neil had choices. He had them every single year I was growing up in that house. He could have been, at minimum, decent. He didn't have to love me. He didn't have to welcome me. He just had to decide, on some basic level, that a child wasn't a threat. He couldn't do that. And that inability, that particular failure of character, is what put him on the wrong side of a CRA letter at his own mother's wake. That's not karma in any mystical sense. That's just cause and effect playing out at human speed. What I think about more, honestly, is Gran, the choice she made when I was 8, pulling up in that station wagon. The choice she made when I was 9, formalizing the guardianship. Quietly, without drama, without making it a conversation piece at family dinners. The choice she made in October, sitting across from Harriet and being clear about what she wanted and who she was leaving it to. Gran was not a dramatic woman. She didn't make speeches. She just kept making the right choice, again and again in small practical ways, and the accumulation of those choices is what protected me in the end. I think that's what I actually learned from all of this. Not that patience is rewarded exactly. That makes it sound more transactional than it is. More like the quality of a life is built in the small decisions. The ones nobody watches you make. Whether you show up, whether you tell the truth to a lawyer even when it's uncomfortable, whether you keep the documentation, whether you drive 3 hours on a weeknight because someone's feet hurt and she's tired and she shouldn't be alone. Declan knew that about me before I fully knew it about myself. He saw the same thing Grant saw, I think. Not potential in some abstract sense. Just someone who had learned, very young, that being underestimated is only a disadvantage if you let it make you small. I didn't let it make me small. I let it make me careful. Those boots are still by the front door of the house on Carson Street. I haven't decided yet whether I'll move back or rent it or something else entirely, but I go there. I sit in Gran's yard. I drink coffee in her Muskoka chair, and I look at the garden and I think about what it takes to build something that lasts. The lilacs will bloom in May. I'll be there.